Greetings and welcome back to the Wild Swans at Coole. In today's video, we are going to discuss about the famous essay called The Language of Paradox from the book of Cleanth Brooks, The Well-Wrought, published in 1947. In this essay, Cleanth Brooks famously quote, "The poet makes up his own language within limits," and in this note, we are going to analyze this statement. Before starting, we have to understand three things. Number one, what is paradox and why this book was written, and then we can understand the importance of this question. The book was written as a reaction to the prominent stream of literary criticism which is called the historical criticism or biographical criticism. This interprets each poetic work within the context of the historical period from which it is emerged. That means we know that whenever someone writes, there is always various things that influence the person. For example, when Shakespeare writes something, maybe the idea of writing that particular poem or book comes from the surroundings that Shakespeare has or the things that is happening around him. But here, critics like I. Richards, Cleanth Brooks, they claim that not everything is related to historical or biographical influences. They want to interpret a text that is without any kind of influence. Or this type of modern critics or new criticism, critics of new criticism or type of formalist critics, they believe that we should interpret a text without knowing any context. So that would be only reader based. So it is not about who is writing the text, but it is about who is reading the text. This is the same thing that is said by in the date of the author. So Brooks vehemently rejected this historical relativism, believing it amounts to giving up our criteria of good and bad and thus repudiating our concept of poetry itself. Brooks instead to offer universal judgments of poems and treat them as self-contained entities able to be interpreted without resource to historical or biographical information. So this type of critics like Brooks, I. Richards, they believe that a text is a whole text without any kind of influence. So when a reader or someone like me or any kind of person is reading the text, they are not thinking of the person. So they are interpreting the text based on their own influences. Brooks has taken the title The Well-Wrought from John Donne's famous poem The Canonization, which is also given as an example in this essay The Language of Paradox. So let's begin. So our question was, according to Cleanth Brooks, the poet makes up his own language within limits. Discuss this statement with reference to the language of paradox. I have given the linked essay in the description. You can go and download it from there. First, we have to understand what is paradox. So paradox is a statement, situation or an idea that seems contradictory or illogical, but when we deeply introspect it or does a deeper inspection, and then we understand that there is a deeper truth or logic, which often involves two opposing elements. For example, less is more, or everything that happens that is bad happens for some good reason. So these kind of thoughts may contradict, like this is completely opposite. What is the meaning behind it? But if we understand the philosophical idea behind it, then we find a logic. So Brooks says that every poet or every writer uses this kind of paradox of their own. They use paradox in various ways through various medium or different types. So to write, to create their own language. So now understand it. In the essay The Language of Paradox, Cleanth Brooks explains that a poet has to make up his own language within limits as he goes on writing poetry. According to Brooks, poetic language is very different from the language of science. The tendency of scientific language is to stabilize terms and freeze them into strict denotations, whereas poetic language is dynamic. In poetry, words continuously modify and qualify one another and often violate their dictionary meanings in order to express complex experiences. So, in scientific language, that means in science, everything has a denotation or a definite meaning, and that cannot be changed. That means if I say that this is potassium cyanide, that is potassium cyanide. So potassium cyanide does not define any other thing. But in case of poetry, one word define various meanings. For example, we have symbols. So sometimes when a poet sometimes compares his beloved with a flower, the cheeks of the beloved with a like tomato. So tomato is here not a vegetable. Red color of the tomato is compared with the cheeks of the beloved. So in this way, in poetry there is various modification and various meaning that are given. As Saussure says that language does not have any inherent meaning, so we give meaning to words, and then that symbol becomes a language or defines a something. So similar way, in poetry, we have various words which define various meaning, or one word that defines various meanings. This is out of context, but we can also relate it with the theory of dreams by Sigmund Freud, that Freud says in dreams the things we see or visualize actually have various meanings with it. So one thing represents various hidden symbols within our dreams. Now come to here. For example, romantic poets like Wordsworth try to use simple and common man's language and prefer direct expression. However, even in their simplicity, their poetry depends heavily on paradox and metaphor. In It's a Beauteous Evening, this is a poem by Wordsworth. Wordsworth contrasts the spontaneous worship of the poet with the unconscious and constant worship of the child. In the poem It's a Beauteous Evening, Wordsworth compares the worship of spirituality of a person with the innocence of the child. Paradoxical expressions such as beauteous evening, calm and free, breathless with adoration show how Wordsworth creates his own poetic language to express the idea of worship. Neoclassical poets like Alexander Pope use a highly polished, refined, and intellectual language, and their paradoxes are often inclined towards irony. So Pope uses irony, which is also one kind of paradox, but by using irony, Pope writes satire to criticize the people around him, the idea that they have around him. For example, in the previous video, we have discussed that in Gulliver's Travel, Jonathan Swift uses Menippean satire to criticize the mental attitudes of people of contemporary England. Now, romantic poets such as Blake and Coleridge combine wonder and irony in their poetry. Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard is also strongly tilted towards irony. Thus, poets of different ages create their own poetic language within certain limits according to their vision and style. Now comes a very important example, that is metaphysical poets. We know that metaphysical poets or poets of metaphysical, they are variously famous for their use of conceit. Conceit is a kind of metaphor where two opposite things are yoked together violently. John Donne deliberately and consciously employs paradox as a serious rhetorical device. Donne makes up his own language through bold and shocking paradoxes such as profane and divine love. In the poem The Canonization, which is used in the essay The Language of Paradox, is mentioned in the essay in the last section, he begins with a tone of exasperation and revives old metaphors like the tapir, phoenix, eagle and dove. So in this poem, Donne compares his love with the beloved through these metaphors. Expressions such as die and rise the same, love saint. So how can love feeling like love or lust can be compared with a saint? Illustrate how contradiction becomes a means of discovering truth. Similarly, metaphysical paradoxes are found in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet and the Phoenix and the Turtle. These poets use paradox to express their unique way of perceiving reality and thus create their own poetic language within limits. Critics like T.S. Eliot, S.T. Coleridge and I. Richards has also commented on poetic language. Coleridge, while discussing Wordsworth, states that Wordsworth's aim was to give the charm of novelty to things of everyday life and to awaken the mind from the lethargy of custom by directing attention to the beauty and wonder of the world around us. So Coleridge says that the way Wordsworth used language, he has used given an aesthetic or beauty, or points out that how simple things around us have a beauty inside through his use of simple language, but also he has touches, or he is able to present that the beauty of the things that when we read his poems like Tintern Abbey or this poem Beauteous Evening. I. Richards points out that poet must work through analogy. So what is analogy? Analogy is comparison between one thing and another to explain something. So because subtle emotional states demand metaphor for their expression. Yes, we know that sometimes for poets, or in any case when we are writing or trying to express something, we use various things without our knowing. So sometimes we see that in our flow or in the spontaneous overflow of feeling, we have seen that various metaphor comes while we write poetry or anything. So T.S. Eliot observes that poetry involves a continual slight alteration of language and the formation of new and sudden combinations. So T.S. Eliot observes that in poetry we have alteration of language. So same thing, but is for example in poetry we have seen that the poet does not use a simple like subject, verb and object. There is we have seen that to make the meaning more understandable, poets sometimes put the verb before or sometimes put the object before. So in this way, or sometimes there is no verb, there is only subject and object, and the formation of a new and sudden combination which create new kind of language, right? So there is no rules. So according to these critics, the use of paradox, metaphor and imagination is not a distortion of language. So we cannot say that in this poetry line, in this poetry line, we don't have like a subject, verb and object. But so this is not a distortion of language but an extension of ordinary language. According to Cleanth Brooks, even the apparently simple and straightforward poet is compelled to use paradox by the very nature of poetry. So poetry is such a thing, according to Brooks, that we will, without our knowing, we will use paradox. The poet actively controls language and constructs it as he writes. So sometimes poet, for example, as I says that there is object, verb, subject, no verb, only object and subject and object. So poets define their own rules. The poet actively controls language and construct it as he writes, defining his own rules. Even technical or polysyllabic terms cannot adequately express poetic experience. Therefore, the poet must walk through contradiction, tension and qualification. Thus, to express complex truths, the poet within limits must continually make up his own language as he goes. So as we know that this is the idea of Brooks. So there are various ideas, and if there is idea, there will be contradiction. So critics like Crane has criticized Cleanth Brooks by saying that Brooks has overanalyzed the idea of paradox and neglects other devices like symbol, metaphor and irony. If you have liked this video, please make sure to like, subscribe and share with your friends.